I'll just hit advance because I don't have a clicker here. Thank you all. So good to see you here this morning. Delighted. Thank you, Amandeep, for kicking us off. Perfect. When it comes to climate change, winning slowly is the same thing as losing, right? We need to be conscious of that. Those are the words of Bill McKibben. I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about causes for hope and how, in particular, China is leading in what is now an exponential market shift underway, and how places like this Beyond Expo can lead and support the innovation at scale that's required. Li Ting just offered a few thoughts about RMI. We're a 40-year-old institution that focuses on using markets and believes that a well-directed market is the fastest way to drive change. Here in China, we specifically focus on supporting China through its energy transition. And while China is the largest CO2 and greenhouse gas emitter in the world, it's also the place of the fastest change, and you'll see some of that represented in the data here going forward. So let me just talk about the story overall. We're in a race right now between two tipping points, a natural one and an economic one, right? And you all are aware that last year was the warmest year on record, that we are right at the threshold of 1.5 degrees that was set by the UN Compact, and that we are deep in the climate emergency. But at that same moment, we are also seeing exponential growth in the critical solutions that are required here for us to solve climate change going forward. These positive tipping points are engaged and are things that we can and together can accelerate faster through smart policy, through markets, and through technology advance. So when we think about this exponential growth, let me just share a few examples. Many you're well aware of, right? But when we think about the power sector, in particular, solar and wind are now the cheapest form of new energy for 85% of the people on the planet, right? In 2020, 1 in 20 cars that were sold were an EV. Last year, it was 1 in 5 cars. Right now in China, it's 1 in 3 cars sold today is an EV here, which starts to speak to that exponential trend. And you're seeing the same thing happens in batteries, but also increasingly in areas like hydrogen and heat pumps, where we're seeing shifts happen. Now, the growth in renewables has been dramatically fed and supported by cost reductions. And if I can get to the next chart here, there we go. Over the past decade, we've seen a 60% reduction in onshore wind, 70% in offshore, and a 76% in solar. Now, what this means is that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels today, but not just cheaper than new fossils. In many cases, we've reached a point where it is cheaper to install new solar or new wind than it is to operate existing fossil. It's an important economic point that we call shutdown economics, right? Where it actually makes sense to put in something new rather than to run what's old. And that is something that is leading to dramatic shifts overall in the economics, and why we're seeing coal plants largely in the developed economies shut down here today. It's a very different story in places that are still thirsty for energy. But we expect these costs to continue declining another 25 to 50% here by the end of this decade, again, furthering the depth and the economics supporting the transition. And when we look at the IEA estimates, we see that over the remainder of this decade, we'll install as much renewables as we've installed fossil fuel generation over the past 120 years. So we're at this moment of exponential growth. When we think about EVs in particular, they're also growing rapidly, and we can see them similarly growing on this S-curve pattern of slow then accelerating growth up to a peak and full market saturation. I mentioned that 1 in 5 cars sold last year was an EV. Some countries are moving more quickly. China has the largest EV market right now. It's 1 in 3 cars, as I mentioned today. It will be over 90% of the vehicles by the end of the decade. And when we look at this globally and how China factors in, this means that we'll get to about 1 in 2 cars globally by 2026. We'll be at 3 in 4 cars globally by the end of the decade. Again, so that by 2040, the amount of fossil fuels that are consumed by 4-wheeled vehicles is dramatically reduced. Now, this is the story of technology disruption. This is what happens, right? And when we look over the last 30 years, we've seen a 99% decrease in the cost of batteries at the same time that we increased the overall effectiveness or the efficiency of batteries, or the energy density as we would call it, more than 5-fold at that moment. So we're seeing this dramatic shift overall. That leads to tipping points in markets, right? In the 1990s, lithium-ion batteries could only reasonably support very concentrated applications in electronics. Then we shifted and saw them become economic in things like 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. Now we're seeing the largest domino fall, specifically in EVs, but increasingly it moves into heavy-duty vehicles, and now we can actually see the economics behind ships and potentially short-range aviation also be favored by the dramatic increases that we've seen. This has led the G7, specifically last month, to sign a global target to increase the overall storage capacity of the world 6-fold here by 2030, from 230 gigawatts of storage this year to 1,500 gigawatts by 2030 because of these improved economics. And to give you a sense of how quickly, again, some of the business solutions are coming forward, if we take CATL, which has a booth right in the back here, last month we saw them announce a 1.5 million kilometer battery that's warranted for those 1.5 million kilometers alongside a 15-year warranty. So we're seeing dramatic improvements in capacity and capability of these clean energy solutions. Now, since I mentioned China, let's talk a little bit about the geopolitics here. China is absolutely at the forefront of the energy transition right now and is leading in 11 of 14 critical technology areas for the clean energy transition. And you can see the exponential growth here across their markets as being very much indicative of this leadership. Now, when we look, technology revolutions happen about once every 40 or 50 years. They're led by a central country that helps create the momentum behind it, and then that progress diffuses across many other countries. And so we do see that where China dominates on the production of solar panels, on wind turbines, on EV batteries, it's also a leading producer and processor of many of the materials that input here. That creates the potential for a large-scale technological transformation here. And what we're talking about is exactly the types of dramatic restructuring of techno-economic systems that we've seen historically. During the Industrial Revolution, right, we saw the proliferation of railways and train transport, of the telegraph and steam-powered ships. Digital, you all know the arrival of the internet. You felt the impact of mobile communications. And now we're witnessing what happens when we shift to electric vehicles, to deep electrification and renewable power, right, and batteries, all as being indicative of this next industrial transition. And it's not uncommon for individuals to naysay, and there are laggards for every transition. Henry Ford's own lawyer told him that the car was a fad and the horse was here to stay. But we can see now the momentum and the shifts that are happening exponentially. But we do have to recognize that the pace and the scale of this transition is up to us, right? That we have the solutions coming forward, not just in renewables and EVs and batteries, but in hydrogen, in areas of electrification and efficiency like heat pumps that can be distributed globally. But we need to create the supportive markets, the supportive policies, the supportive technological environments that spur and in the end buoyantly create that next energy future that we so desperately want and need to respond to the climate crisis. And that's exactly why we're here at Beyond. We're here to catalyze and create more of this exponential thinking and more of this exponential progress. Now, I do want to say I've talked a lot about the growth in supply, and one of the things that we have to be conscious of is the most effective way to deal with energy emissions is to not produce them in the first place. And energy efficiency has been the largest combatant of climate change historically. It's produced the greatest gains. And when we look at the combination of growth in renewable supply alongside the reduction in overall energy requirements and energy efficiency, we see that fossil fuels get squeezed out in the process here. And by our numbers and by the IEA's numbers, we're right now peaking the amount of fossil fuels that we need globally as these two different pinchers kind of overall reduce the need for fossil fuels going forward. So these are the trends that will revolutionize the energy landscape. We all have a part of it, right? We're all players in helping to advance and promote, in the end, this climate solution at a critical moment. And whether you're doing it because of health, whether you're doing it because of pollution, whether you're doing it for your kids because of the next generation, whether you're doing it for climate, whether you're doing it for economics, for any of these reasons, we all can agree that the transition should happen faster, and we can align and put our purposes together and in the process create that next energy future. Reminding you all that it's not too late, but later is too late, right? Thank you, everyone.